Following World War II, teenagers and young people were celebrated unlike any other time before. A lot of this has to do with sort of the GI Bill, that the returning soldiers had the opportunity to get a college education. This meant that their families could have a better quality of life, and the idea of going to college became the norm. And so there was sort of, rather than childhood and adulthood, there was this time in between where you are a young person, where you are focusing on being a student and having a good time. And there's several things that will happen in American culture with this sort of value placed on youth. Now, there is sort of the traditional idea of what young people do with their time, and this would have been something in the 1930s and during the war as well. But with so many kids now, with a focus on them in terms of culture, there are things that are going to be created specifically for them. So, like the Mickey Mouse Club, there weren't a whole lot of kids programs on the radio or television before this time. There were a few, but it wasn't the norm. Movies are also hugely important to understanding teen culture in the 1950s. We've got actors like Marlon Brando and James Dean, who represented the idea of the outsider, or as the movie's called, the rebel without a cause. The guys who didn't fit into the perfect picture of what it meant to be an obedient child and have your whole life planned out before you. And these were the bad boys. And this was very attractive, both to women who were falling in love with them, but for people who didn't feel like they fit in, and now they see something that's like them, even though it's a feature film. So movies are being made specifically for these audiences. There's also television programs that are being made for these audiences, specifically with music like American Bandstand. Young people had always listened to slightly different music than their parents and grandparents, but now we've got rock and roll, which is just louder and doesn't fit into the same type of categories like music had in the past. We look at these rock and roll bands today and we're like, oh, that's not very rock and roll. They seem so tame. But at the time, it was such a huge departure from what was seen as proper music. What's really considered the first rock and roll band is Bill Haley and the Comets, and their most famous song is Rock Around the Clock. Other artists like Chuck Berry, or even Elvis Presley, the way he moves, oh my goodness, it's so sexual. And so not only are young people listening to their albums, they can see these artists. We start to see, the Motown artists. This was pretty revolutionary in terms of color, that we have white people listening to music by black artists. So this emphasis on teen culture and music and media will ultimately have a pretty huge social impact on America. Just like we talked about with the 1920s, there is an emphasis on cars, that teens can drive cars to get away from their parents. They don't have to go to dates on the front porch of their home. They can go get a burger at the local drive-through or go to a movie at the drive-in. And that was one of your terms for one of your conversations. With all of this, though, there is some fear that America is moving away from traditional values, away from traditional Christian values. And some people felt that this would put us in danger of falling prey to communism, that Christianity, that having that faith background in America, is what would protect us from becoming like the communists. And so we have people like Billy Graham, the evangelist who specialized in these big meetings, like these tent revivals, and people started to listen to them. If you read the book or saw the movie Unbroken, this is what happened to Louis Zamperini, is he came back from the war sort of a broken man and ended up sort of stumbling across one of these meetings. And so people started coming to Christianity and sort of a revitalization of Christianity. Here you can see a very young Billy Graham meeting President Eisenhower. So he was very well known, and his message was becoming popular throughout the country. But he wasn't the only one who was sort of evangelizing in America. There's also Father There's also Fulton Sheen, a Catholic pastor or reverend, who ended up with a radio program and writing books. And so people were looking to him, sort of looking for this moral foundation, this religious foundation that made us different from the communists, a part of the Red Scare almost. For those who weren't inherently religious, there's things like the power of positive thinking, which is still very much part of our culture. Oh, I'm sending positive thoughts your way, and all of that. Another huge element of 1950s culture is the baby boom. That men came back from war, married their high school sweethearts, and had lots and lots of babies. And this is because partly, not only were they coming back from war, but again, the GI Bill, that it gave many of these veterans a better quality of life. They could get a college education and therefore make better money and afford to have more kids. And it really is a boom. If you look at the numbers from about 1945 to 1960, a huge uptick in the birth rate. And we really, where the idea of the traditional family has been a thing, we see this even more so. We've got mom and dad and a few kids. And while women did work in the factories during the war, now it is their time to go back into the kitchen, back into the home to raise these families. The father goes out, he works, he brings home the bacon, and the mother cooks it. And this idea of suburbia, that this is the American dream, to own your own home, to have a yard to mow, and all of that. That becomes more possible with the creation of what we would call tract homes, or these planned communities. The most famous were built by the Levitt brothers. The first was built in Long Island, New York, Levittown. And these sort of suburb communities where everyone could afford houses, and they were all exactly the same. But what happened in some places is that these communities would create covenants or sort of community contracts that would prevent Black people from being able to move in. And so the court case Shelley versus Kramer went all the way to the Supreme Court, and it said that that is not constitutional, that you can't legally in these documents prevent families of color from moving into particular neighborhoods. Now, it still was going to happen sort of just by fact, but at least legally, the courts are saying this is not okay to create this segregation. As cities grow, and it's not just urban sprawl, but now it is suburban sprawl, these communities are going to want to be connected. So that's going to happen with the Eisenhower interstate system. In one sense, this will help provide jobs for Americans. It will help the economy because it'll help the booming car industry in Detroit, but it also is considered a defense mechanism. Under the Eisenhower interstate system, 1 mile out of every 5 has to be in a straight line. And this is to allow a plane to land if necessary. So what if we are attacked by the Soviets? That militarily we would be able to protect ourselves. It's not unlike Hitler building the Autobahn in the 1930s. Yes, we are providing jobs for Germans. We are providing a means for Germans to travel the country and see wonderful Germany, but it also would be used for the German military during the war. In response to this growing car culture, the idea of the road trip is created. It wasn't really a thing before this. Companies that we've talked about, like McDonald's, feeding these people who are on road trips, even Jack in the Box was created in the 1950s. To totally change topics, we talked about Dr. Kinsey. Kinsey was a zoologist who had been studying beetles for most of his career, and he turned his attention towards the sexual habits and behaviors of Americans. He interviewed thousands upon thousands of Americans and asked them very factual questions about their behaviors. And the idea had been that the norm was, you married your high school sweetheart, you got married, you had not had premarital sex, and you only had sex with that one person. That was what was accepted as normal and what everyone did. But what Kinsey found out by interviewing these thousands of Americans is the reality was very different, that people acted much differently than people had expected. And when this was published in the 50s, in one sense it was very controversial, but people thought it was fascinating because they felt less alone in terms of feeling like an outsider, like they were doing something different. But it was incredibly controversial. In one sense, that could be considered part of the counterculture, but what is even more of the counterculture beyond the Kinsey report are the beatniks, the beat generation. Those who say that they don't want to fit in anyway into this idea of the American dream, or going to your job in your suit and going home and mowing your lawn, or playing catch with your children. So we've got artists and musicians and writers like Bob Dylan or Jack Kerouac or J.D. Salinger. Now the stereotype of the beatnik generation would be in some New York coffee house reading poetry, and you'd snap after they're done. That's not entirely inaccurate. These were people who wanted to live by their own rules and didn't want to follow what the wider culture was doing. Kind of the hipsters of the 1950s. So here we have Jack Kerouac, who wrote On the Road, I don't know, I don't care, and it doesn't make any difference. So there is this sense of apathy, to be sure. And then Allen Ginsberg, I don't think there is any truth, there are only points of view. So we were seeing this postmodern belief of everything is relative. We don't have to follow rules because there aren't necessarily rules. It's only what we create for ourselves.